Attention! Immediately after this video was prepared, Trump sharply shortened his ultimatum. Now the Kremlin has not 50 but only 10 days. But I hasten to assure you that the essence and meaning of what is said next remains valid. Here I analyze not only the deadline but also key statements, the situation with weapons, sanctions, and negotiations. So, all of this is about the most important things. Let's watch. A few weeks ago, on July 14, Donald Trump, at a meeting with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, said something that many experts are already calling a radical shift in the United States president's foreign policy toward Russia. Or, at the very least, he started it. There were no longer the traditional complimentary or even fawning remarks about Putin without directly condemning the Kremlin dictator. Trump made it clear that he was extremely and radically disappointed with the results of previous negotiations with Moscow, or rather, with their almost complete absence. The American president stated that the United States is imposing secondary sanctions of 100% against Russia and its trading partners, if there is no ceasefire deal in Ukraine within about 50 days. And naturally, such a statement instantly stirred up the whole world, especially Ukraine. Everyone started thinking and guessing what this latest sharp statement from Daddy Donald means. He has made quite a few of them in recent months. Today, we will take a detailed look at Trump's ultimatum. Are these just simple threats, or are they the final warnings to the Kremlin dwarf? Or is it the first sign of a major shift in the United States foreign policy course? Is it a possible realization that it's impossible to do any serious business with Russia, or just another element of political games? Ukraine, will the aid to Ukraine continue and under what conditions? And of course, we'll try to predict what exactly will happen. At the end of this 50-day period, we will provide only the clearest and most balanced analysis of events. My name is Semyon, Mega Show television channel. Let's get down to business. Why exactly 50 days? The first thing that catches the eye is actually this strange period. 50 days. Why not 30 or 100 days? If you count from July 14, the deadline falls on September 2, which in itself is a very significant marker. I'll explain the importance of this date a bit later if we look at the situation in the simplest terms. The 50-day period came from American insider information based on the Axios web agency. According to its sources, during the last phone conversation between Trump and Putin, the dictator once again flatly refused to cease fire, and he brazenly stated that in the next 60 days he plans to actively advance in Ukraine in order to reach the administrative borders of the regions that are written into the Russian constitution. This conversation took place on July 3rd. If you count from that date, we end up at September 2nd again. Thus, at first glance, it may seem that Trump has effectively given Putin the green light to capture the Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhzhia and Kherson regions before the beginning of autumn. Thus, as Kremlin propagandists claim, the special military operations goals would be achieved. It turns out that the American president once again caved in and gave the aggressor carte blanche, abandoning Ukraine to its fate without any support. Not quite. Life-saving Patriots. The answer to the last question was actually given in that same conversation with Rutte. On July 14, Trump openly stated that 17 Patriot air defense systems were being prepared for shipment to Europe, and that some of them would be immediately handed over to Ukraine. Of course, this sparked a heated debate about whether he actually meant the number of batteries or just the launchers. How many and which items will Ukraine get, and how many missiles will the United States supply? The last aspect is especially important, since it is public knowledge that the stockpiles of air defense missiles accumulated by Ukraine over the previous years are being depleted very quickly. Their production, to put it mildly, shows no tendency for significant increase. For example, throughout 2024, the American military-industrial complex managed to produce no more than 650 missiles for the Patriot systems. Moreover, most of them did not go to Ukraine but were used for domestic needs, as well as to support their strategic ally, Israel. By the way, a few words about the Israeli factor. It also significantly affects the volume and pace of arms supplies to Ukraine. The recently concluded 12-day war with Iran has seriously depleted American arsenals. According to experts, the United States used up to 20% of all ammunition for its missile defense systems in this conflict. As you can imagine, it will take time to restore the previous potential. To be more specific, According to the latest data, Ukraine will receive 5 Patriot systems. In any case, that's what the German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius says, but not directly from the United States, rather from Germany. And in return, Germany will receive brand new air defense batteries directly from American warehouses. However, this scheme will take time, at least several months. There is no detailed information about the number of Patriot missiles. After all, it's a military secret. But the true essence of Trump's statement is not about the number of Patriots. And it's not even about how quickly they will be delivered to Ukraine, but about the very fact that they will be supplied. After all, just a few weeks ago, amid the suspension of military aid to Ukraine, not only Kremlin propagandists but also quite reputable Western publications were seriously writing that Trump, so to speak, had dropped the subject, distanced himself from the war, abandoned Ukraine, or even worse, had supposedly made a secret deal with Putin behind everyone's back. And any moment now, the United States would put strong pressure on Kyiv to force the Ukrainian authorities to accept Russia's terms for ending the war. But now, no one is even mentioning this anymore, not even in Russia. Let's also not forget that all the American weapons, ammunition and gear that are now being supplied to Ukraine. This is nothing more than the leftovers of Biden's aid, or more precisely, what's left of the $61 billion that Congress voted for back in April of last year. But more than a year has already passed. Biden's support is supposed to end this August, at the latest in September, and no further decisions about additional aid to Ukraine have been made. And here Trump made his move naturally for the whole world to see. The promised Patriots caused a dam break effect and demonstrated that the new American president has not backed down at all, but is ready to continue supporting Ukraine. Everything comes at a price. Of course, in this whole barrel of honey, there is a spoonful of tar, and not just one. Unfortunately, the United States will no longer support Ukraine for free. This has already become clear, once and for all. Trump said exactly that. We will produce weapons, but they will pay for them. Not us, meaning the European countries. Moving on. During his conversation with the mentioned NATO Secretary General Rutte, he clarified that the United States will send its Patriot systems to Europe for money, and they will be able to transfer their own similar weapons. Specifically quoting the American president, "We will produce the best weapons, send them to NATO, and they will be able to transfer them to a third country." And since the conversation took place in the context of continuing aid to Ukraine, it's clear without words who Trump meant by third countries. Thus, what has been talked about almost since the results of the United States elections became known is becoming a reality, that the new president will shift the burden of financing the war onto Europe. However, until recently, many people, especially in Ukraine, hoped that Trump, even if he resisted and argued, would eventually support Biden's concept. He would keep offering free aid as grants or, alternatively, provide military support via the United States contribution to the fund established by the well-known resource deal. That is, essentially for free both for Ukraine and for European countries, but no. The American president is demanding real money, and he doesn't care at all who exactly pays for the goods. Ukraine, whose economy is mostly destroyed, or the European countries, whose combined economic power and defense industry output are still significantly behind the United States. But that's just how Trump is, whether we like it or not, and we'll have to deal with this unfortunate fact at least until the end of his 4-year term. But there's something else. The United States will still continue to provide Ukraine with information, intelligence, and most importantly, satellite reconnaissance data absolutely free of charge, because without it, the missile attack warning system simply won't function. In that case, even 100 Patriots won't help. Therefore, today we can confidently state that America's eyes and ears remain in Ukraine, and no matter what anyone says, that's worth a lot. Will Ukraine get long-range weapons? Several days before July 14, many Western news agencies were reporting that, amid disappointment with negotiations with Putin, Trump was preparing a lot of new weapons for Ukraine, including long-range missiles. Moreover, they discussed the possibility of supplying not only the well-known Army Tactical Missile System missiles, which have a range of up to 300 kilometers, but also air-to-ground missiles with a range of 800 kilometers. And even Tomahawk missiles with an even greater range, capable of flying distances from 1,000 to 2,500 kilometers. If Ukraine received the latter, its armed forces could reach Moscow, St. Petersburg, the Volga, or even beyond the Urals. That's advanced technology. However, it's too early to celebrate just yet. In his conversation with Rutte, Trump mentioned Patriots and only them, but at the same time, he did not rule out the possibility of supplying long-range weapons in the future. And here, there are two possible scenarios. The first version is that Trump really does not want to supply long-range missiles to Ukraine, fearing an escalation in relations with Russia up to the threat of a direct nuclear confrontation. And the second is that Trump has already decided to supply missiles to Ukraine, but wants to do it covertly. Just like Biden once delivered Army tactical missile system, and then Moscow was faced with a fait accompli when its airfields, training grounds and warehouses turned into piles of smoldering ruins. Sanctions are being put on hold, and a similar situation applies to the further introduction of American sanctions. I won't dwell specifically on the well-known bill about 500% tariffs prepared by Ukraine's longtime friend and lobbyist, Senator Lindsey Graham. I'll just say one thing. If it were adopted, it would seriously affect the countries that conduct intensive trade with Russia, primarily China and India. However, Trump decided to hold his horses for now. On July 14, he announced that he was introducing new tariffs against Moscow. If there is no ceasefire deal within 50 days, these secondary sanctions will be imposed at 100% on Russia's trading partners. Not the expected 500%, but exactly 100%. At the same time, the White House chief immediately clarified his position. According to him, he can impose 100% tariffs even without a law, which still needs to get support in both houses of Congress. Trump believes that both 500% and 100% tariffs will have the same effect. In turn, Rutte, who was present at the meeting, stated that if he were in Putin's place and heard what Trump was planning for these 50 days, he would think about it and sit down at the negotiating table. That's a reasonable remark, whatever you say. For Ukraine, any secondary sanctions in any form and of any size are a good thing, because they undermine Russia's ability to export its energy resources one way or another. After all, without the dollars earned from oil and gas, further financing of the war and support for the social economy and economic stability within the country will simply be impossible. The main thing is that the imposed sanctions actually work, and for that, all possible ways to bypass them must be blocked as much as possible. However, in this situation, it is impossible to manage without a consolidated position from the West. The third round of Istanbul. I have already mentioned several times that Trump gave a 50-day deadline not just for nothing, but to activate negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. The result was supposed to be a ceasefire with the prospect of further freezing this bloody and prolonged war. Unfortunately, the two previous rounds of the Istanbul negotiations, which took place on May 16 and June 2, did not bring significant results. Moreover, they simply reached a dead end, all because of the stubbornly obstinate position of the Russian delegation, or more precisely, the one who was giving them instructions from above. After all, its formal head, this pseudo-historian and mediocre propagandist Vladimir Medinsky, is definitely not capable of independent diplomatic activity, and simply parrots the orders handed down from the Kremlin. Although, to be completely objective, the previous rounds of negotiations in Turkey can't be called entirely fruitless. Thanks to them, more prisoners have returned home in the past 3 months than in the previous 3 years. Also, the remains of hundreds of fallen defenders of Ukraine were given the chance to be laid to rest with dignity, but nothing more than that. No geopolitical issues have been resolved. And all because the memorandum draft for conflict resolution presented by Medinsky and his team is essentially an ultimatum with deliberately impossible and absolutely humiliating conditions for Ukraine. I would like to specifically remind you that in its memorandum draft, Ukraine calls for first declaring a long-term ceasefire and only then discussing the terms of peace in more detail. And Russia demands, in order to cease fire, either the withdrawal of the Ukrainian armed forces from the Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson and Zaporizhzhia regions of Ukraine, or the signing of a so-called roadmap that would include the withdrawal of Ukrainian troops. The well-known denazification and demilitarization, with a mandatory limitation on the size of the Ukrainian armed forces and a ban on nationalist parties. An official renunciation of all territories annexed by Russia, including Crimea, as well as a neutral and non-nuclear status for Ukraine, the lifting of all sanctions imposed since 2014 and so on. What else is there to comment on? These are real terms of Ukraine's capitulation, albeit a hidden one, but still capitulation. Unconditional acceptance of all these terms would not only mean a radical weakening of Ukraine's defense capability, but also a guaranteed internal civil conflict, which in the long run could easily lead to the collapse of Ukrainian statehood. And Moscow would achieve by hybrid means what it hasn't been able to achieve by military means for 4 years now. And so, on July 23, the long-awaited third round of the Istanbul negotiations took place, which lasted just over 40 minutes, quite expectedly. Ukraine, of course, proposed a ceasefire along the entire front line. Also, arrange a personal meeting between Volodymyr Zelensky and Vladimir Putin by summer's end to discuss terms for a final peace agreement. But the Russian delegation actually responded to this constructive proposal with a categorical refusal, disguising it with various strange suggestions aimed solely at further delaying the negotiations. Among them were the formation of working groups on political, humanitarian and military issues that would operate online, as well as the introduction of short ceasefires on the front line for a day or two to collect the wounded and the dead. In general, it can be said with confidence that the negotiations have once again reached a dead end. Putin and his security service gang are absolutely confident in their own military victory, and therefore they are not even trying to look for common ground or make compromises. The positions of Ukraine and Russia remain diametrically opposed. And again, September 3rd, as I already mentioned, Trump's 50 days expire by September 2nd, and that's not just any date. It's the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II. I want to specifically remind viewers that the deadliest war in human history did not end on May 8, 1945, nor on May 9, as those raised in the Soviet tradition are used to thinking. The surrender of Germany only meant the end of the war in Europe, while in Asia, hostilities continued until the surrender of Japan, which, as you understand, happened on September 2, 1945. Getting back to our topic, it's not exactly known whether Donald Trump calculated his deadline to coincide with that date, or if someone from the White House advisory team suggested it to him. And if it is just a coincidence, then it's more than symbolic. Moreover, it could have quite a practical meaning. The thing is, the most reputable British publishing house published insight on July 18, that the very next day, after Trump's 50 days have passed, on September 3rd, China will solemnly celebrate the 80th anniversary of its victory. In Beijing, on Tiananmen Square, which by the way is one of the largest in the world, a grand military parade will be held. And most importantly, Xi Jinping invited Putin and Trump to this celebration, and a few days later, the American and Russian sides confirmed the invitation. So far, it is reliably known that the Kremlin dwarf will come to the Beijing parade, just as Xi once visited Moscow on May 9. So this will be a kind of response from Russia, especially since a reciprocal visit like this is required by diplomatic etiquette. And as is known, Putin is extremely fond of such things, being a person deeply ingrained with Soviet traditions combined with great imperial chauvinism. He definitely won't miss such a victory celebration. But with Trump, things remain unclear. As of this video's preparation, there's no official confirmation of his visit to Beijing. By the way, let me know if it has been confirmed now or not. But the main question is what will happen if the potential three-way meeting actually takes place. Some outspoken conspiracy theorists, propagandists, and poorly qualified experts are once again talking about a new Yalta conference. That the three old men will once again carve up the world into spheres of influence, just like they did back in '45. I won't discuss these fantasies. I have a separate video for that, where I explained in detail and in simple terms why a global Yalta 2.0 is simply impossible today. If we make a prediction based on common sense, then a potential meeting between Trump, Xi, and Putin can only bring real results if some preliminary agreements are reached. But for now, nothing suggests that such a scenario will unfold because of the stubbornly obstinate position of the Moscow Führer and the cunningly patient tactics of the Chinese General Secretary. Although such a meeting in itself could be a signal to the whole world that America is still strong and remains relevant. And further economic support of Moscow by Beijing could eventually cause major problems for China. After all, the sanctions haven't been lifted yet. And what will happen next? To put it as briefly as possible, after the 50-day period the war will continue without a doubt, and it may even start to escalate, especially if Ukraine receives the Trump-era aid packages. Of course, not for free. In any case, the aggressor shows no intention of even reaching a ceasefire and continues to push forward on almost all fronts. I'm extremely skeptical about the negotiations, or rather about the possibility of them continuing. It's quite possible that there will be fourth, fifth and sixth rounds of negotiations, but whether they take place in Istanbul, Jeddah or Riyadh doesn't really matter anymore. The Russian and Ukrainian delegations may agree to another exchange of prisoners and deceased bodies. It's also possible that Russia will return some of the children who were forcibly deported in 2022, so purely humanitarian issues and nothing more. And that's not surprising at all, because for negotiations of this kind to be successful, at least one of three factors needs to work. There should be at least a minimal convergence of positions between the warring sides, which would create a basis for further compromise. But Putin is not going to make concessions even in small things, being firmly convinced of the imminent collapse of the front and the military defeat of Ukraine. And all sources absolutely confirm such victorious sentiments in the Kremlin. Or one or both sides must exhaust their resources so that the warring states realize the futility of continuing the fighting any further. And then the hot phase of the war could easily turn into a cold one, just like it happened during the Korean War. And the third option is the complete military defeat of one of the sides. I have nothing to comment on since the current situation at the front doesn't indicate anything like that will happen anytime soon. After all, in order to occupy even those regions that Moscow arbitrarily included in its constitution, you don't need a group of mercenaries, but a new partial mobilization. And even that might not help, because in order to capture the much-desired Kherson, you have to cross one of the widest rivers in Europe. And for that, you definitely can't do without the Black Sea Fleet here, and Putin understands this perfectly well. Let's sum up what we have at this point in short. Trump's 50-day deadline itself is more of a public relations move, but his decision to supply weapons to Ukraine in the future is no longer in any doubt. Not on the best terms, but right before our eyes, a new scheme for supporting Ukraine is taking shape, which will apparently work in the coming years. The United States produces, Europe pays, Ukraine receives. Despite all its shortcomings, it will still ensure the continued survival of Ukrainian statehood and the ongoing fight against the Moscow horde. It is also quite possible to introduce secondary sanctions, which may well drive a wedge between Putin and the countries of the so-called Global South, and thereby significantly ensure and weaken the economic power of Moscow. As for the negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, they are likely to continue, but their real effectiveness will be close to zero. The positions of the parties remain far apart, and the negotiation process is complicated by ongoing military actions and mutual distrust. In the short term, the most likely scenario is the continuation of limited dialogue on humanitarian issues, while the deadlock on key political and military aspects remains. To achieve progress, either a significant change in the military situation will be required, or more active involvement of a key international mediator, the United States. Alternatively, there would need to be a change in the political philosophy of the Russian state. However, for now, this is nothing more than science fiction. Well, that's all from me. Thank you to all the channel sponsors for your financial support and to all the viewers for watching this video in full. See you in the next episode. Bye.